Good afternoon. Kia ora koutou. I'm Murray Bruce. I'm the Executive Director of the Helen Foundation. Our foundation is delighted to be hosting today's discussion featuring Minister of Trade, the Honourable Todd McClay, and his immediate predecessor in the role, the Honourable Damien O'Connor, discussing bipartisanship in New Zealand's trade policy. As a former diplomat, I'm particularly excited for today's conversation. Building and maintaining New Zealand's network of trading relationships around the world is one of the most important things we can do to grow our country's prosperity and to pay for the high quality public services that New Zealanders expect and deserve. Between them, our panelists have a combined nearly 8 years' experience in the role of Minister of Trade, and both will have deep insights into how New Zealand can maximise the value of our trading relationships over the long term. We're also delighted to have in Rachel Taulelei, one of New Zealand's most experienced and accomplished business leaders, as our moderator for today. Before I hand you over to Rachel, a few quick notes. Firstly, Facing Up to Our Future, a book our foundation has helped publish, is now available for pre-order. It features 20 of New Zealand's top thinkers examining a wide range of challenges facing our country in the 2020s, including climate change, fiscal pressures, the cost of living, infrastructure backlogs, the housing crisis, among many others. Importantly, the book proposes constructive solutions to these structural challenges. You can pre-order at dunmore.co.nz. My colleague Victoria will have pasted the link in the comments section, or the chat section. And if you're a member of our foundation, you should have already received an email with a discount code for a $15 discount on this very important book. If you're not a member and you'd like to see more webinars like today's, we'd love to have you join us. Membership is affordable and registration is a quick and easy process via the link, also in the chat section. Finally, during the month of July, we'll run a series of 4 webinars featuring the authors of this book, talking about their chapters and the steps that New Zealand needs to take to confront the range of challenges facing us. The first of these discussions will be midday next Wednesday, the 8th of July, and we'll focus on housing, energy and sustainability. And I think there's a link to register for that webinar in today's chat as well. As always, your cameras and microphones are switched off, but we'd love for you to participate in today's webinar, and the best way to do that is to ask a question as it occurs to you during today's webinar in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And Rachel will put those to our panelists a little later in this afternoon session. And just before we begin, thanks to our Honorary Senior Fellow, Stephen Jacoby, for helping arrange today's session. So with that, thanks very much to our panelists for joining, and over to you, Rachel.
O tēnā rā tātou, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei pai tukutuku. I ngā rangatira, Minister McClay me Damien hoki, tēnā korua, o te rā e hoa mā tēnā koutou. As Murray's mentioned, my name is Rachel Taulelei, and I am delighted to be moderating this conversation on behalf of the Helen Foundation. Today's session, as you'll know, is about trading partners, lessons for bipartisan policy making from New Zealand's trade policy, and it's a timely one. New Zealand's trade policy is often held up as a masterclass in political maturity, a rare arena where successive governments have chosen long-term national economic certainty over short-term political point scoring. But as the global trading landscape fractures and becomes more protectionist, that hard-won consensus faces new pressures. With the international trading system under real pressure and New Zealand's prosperity closely tied to our ability to access global markets, the question of how we build durable, consistent trade policy settings feels really more important than ever. We're fortunate to have, anticipating 2 people, I will say at this moment we have 1 person, which means we get twice as much of his time. We have the Minister, the Honourable Todd McClay, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Investment, online with us at the moment, and the Honourable Damien O'Connor, Labour's Spokesperson for Trade and Export Growth, is just around the corner. But those are 2 people who have lived this from both sides of the house. Between them, as Murray said, decades of experience shaping and implementing trade policy across successive governments. So while we're waiting on Damien, we're actually going to let the Minister McClay, jump right in, and I'm going to focus all of my questions on him, which I'm sure he is thrilled about. Welcome, Minister.
Kia ora. Damien's just trying to make an entrance. He'll be here soon.
Do you think he's an impact player? He's trying to make a grand entrance. Well, let's get started anyway, because I know that we have a number of people online who are really keen to hear your thoughts on this. And in fact, my first question is for you, Minister, which is to say, I'd love it if you could start us with giving us your overview of key aspects of New Zealand's trade policy over the last few decades. And in your experience, share what you think or what you believe New Zealand's been trying to achieve and why. And just a final tag on there, perhaps even more importantly, what do you think we've succeeded at?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, thanks very much, and for everybody tuning in, thank you. I very much enjoy these conversations, and one of the questions that I think we're probably going to get is around about bipartisanship. So Damien and I being able to do this together in itself, is a very clear demonstration of that. Well, how do I typify New Zealand's trade policy? It is about better access or more access for New Zealanders overseas, levelling the playing field. Yeah, there are times we'll talk about, more holistically, the way that we need to do it and work together. But as Trade Minister, the first time I was Minister this time, it is fundamentally about getting advantage for New Zealanders and markets overseas, either deals so we have better access, preferential access before others do, or levelling the playing field so that the largest degree possible we can be the same with those we compete against. The reason for that is I firmly believe New Zealanders, if it's a level playing field, can compete fairly, will win. They do well everywhere that they go, just as our trade negotiators have done exceptionally well for a small country of just 5 million people at the bottom of the world almost. So fundamentally, it sits in 3 areas. Number one, expanding market access for goods and services. Two, support of a rules-based trading system. They're not exclusive or mutually exclusive. They go together. A trade agreement is nothing magical other than a common set of rules, rights and responsibilities set in place by rules, so that ultimately, businesses can understand what it is they need to do. If you want to go and put effort into a market and you can rely upon the rules and the systems are there, you have a greater chance of, getting a return on that. You lower risk, you lower costs. So those are the first two, but they go very importantly together. The third is around promoting diversification and resilience, not only in markets, but also in what it is we export. So if you cast your mind back, some years, more than 20 years, we were heavily reliant on probably three parts of the world: the US, the UK, and Japan for a lot of our trade. China at that time was a very small part, about 3% of our exports. And we very much learnt when the United Kingdom joined the then EU, the European Common Market, how vulnerable we were to changes. That was probably one of the first big shocks. Almost everything that we had built, business and industry on in New Zealand, particularly the primary sector, the incomes of New Zealanders were reliant upon the UK, and overnight that all but was taken away. That moved New Zealand's successive governments through a trade strategy to look to diversify, and not only diversify markets, but also, what we sell. We used to be a country that was heavily reliant upon the primary sector. It is still a very important, if not possibly the most important part of our exports, but putting that aside, services and tech and all sorts of other things now grow. So Rachel, I was thinking about what are the three fundamentally most important things that happened to New Zealand to shape our future. Number one was the China Free Trade Agreement. Now as our number one trading partner, we sell them $23 billion this year. We'll buy 20 billion from them. We're one of the few countries in the world that we sell more than we buy from them. But it's not about the growth of trade that fundamentally was the most important thing for us. It was one of the first, if not the first, high quality free trade agreement China had ever done. It was based upon rules, and those rules have now spread to other agreements that China has done, and others around the region. The reinforcement of that rules-based approach that New Zealand companies can rely upon. And without those rules, we would be selling more to China, of course, or buying more from them, but I don't think it would have got to the size of our most important trading nation, $23 billion. The second was the formulation of the European communities that went on to be the European Union. And if you think about all of those countries there, we had very, very modest trade with them apart from the UK when they were still members. And it comes to the uniform nature of rules that's made it easier for New Zealand businesses to sell in one or a number of countries in the European Union. And so ultimately it comes back to those rules that we can well understand, and it brings down barriers and costs, and it's made it easier for New Zealand exporters to move from the United Kingdom as their sole almost interest in that part of the world to very, very many countries, and our trade has grown as a result. And the final one is the CPTPP, which was the TPP. That, of course, is about trade, but it is about forming rules across, the Trans-Pacific, and it reaches further than that now, of course, from North America to South America to Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific or Oceania with New Zealand, Australia, and of course it is now across to the United Kingdom. And it comes to the point again that we now have access to these countries we wouldn't before. It is understandable for New Zealand exporters and it is benefiting them, but it also means that there are rules that are spreading across those countries that New Zealand, as a tiny, small trading nation, has been able to have an effect upon. Because in each of those situations I'm talking about, we were almost at the forefront of that. The P4 that went to the TPP, the CPTPP, that was New Zealand, along with that agreement with China. Finally, what have we been good at? Everything. New Zealand exporters are very good at what they do. We've seen trade grow significantly over the last 3 years, and it is a result of, Kiwis being exceptional, the highest quality, safest food producers in the world. They care about the environment and animals, and they meet those obligations. Our services sector is doing extremely well and growing so very quickly. Across the board, we're doing well, but we're doing well in all markets, not just a few. And as we've had challenges in the US because of changing nature of their trade policy and tariffs, we've done well elsewhere, although we continue to, punch above our weight, probably, given the challenges in the US there. And so Kiwi exporters have done it very well. Our negotiators are good at what they do, very good at what we do. The deals that we have in place, others wish they had often. The India Free Trade Agreement is a great example of that. It is better than Australia's in many areas, better than the UK, better than the European Union, little country punching and doing well. And then finally, I think what we do well is bipartisanship in trade. It won't always seem like it, but it does exist. Every trade agreement New Zealand has in place has had a supermajority in our parliament. The two main parties have supported every single one. We won't agree with everything that's in them. Sometimes we may strongly disagree with parts of them, but we have recognised that trade agreements are in the best interest of New Zealand, and they've evolved over time. And whilst it is okay for parties to have a different view and to distinguish themselves and perhaps not support them, what we have done better than most countries in the world is continue to show bipartisanship and our approach to negotiation and the way that we put these things in law through our parliament. It sends a great signal to businesses and our exporters that actually, the Parliament of New Zealand, governments support them in trade. We want them to do well out on the world stage. Final reason that's important. Did you know that if you have a company in New Zealand that exports, it generally earns more, it pays its workers more than companies don't export, and they employ more women on average than a company that is not involved in export. And there'll be lots of reasons for that. Doesn't matter. Actually, it's a good thing.
Most certainly. And I think your emphasis there on bipartisanship is the perfect segue to inviting Damien into the conversation. Lovely to have you, Damien.
I kept talking to give him a chance to get here.
Oh, thank you very much, Todd. Yes. Look, kia ora, and apologies, I can't match the blue tie of Todd, but I've tried the red shirt. I'm actually in Timaru here and unfortunately on the road. So apologies if I was meant to be dressed in a tie and formal. Can I just start by saying thank you very much to Helen Clark Foundation for setting this up. We need more open discussions across our economy, across our society on many significant issues. Can I say that going way back as a farmer, I guess I was a bit of a trade skeptic. We had some preferential access into the UK. Things were pretty good. We had the dairy board and it was all organised. And then, of course, in the 70s when the UK, we parted company and we had to move to Asia or look elsewhere in the world, it was a new awakening, I think, for farmers and for everyone across our economy. And as Todd said, it's, opened up opportunities for us. Moving forward, I came into Parliament and I guess I had an interest always in agriculture. Trade was, one of those things that was necessary. wasn't aware of, and probably still not, of all the details of trade law and the complexities, but understanding its importance to a trading nation like our own. So then, of course, through the 2000s in government, we were building up relationships with China, and I can remember being on the inaugural flight to Beijing as Minister of Tourism, building good connections with a country that was growing. The free trade agreement that Phil Goff signed was amazing. It carried us through the GFC. It's given us incredible opportunities, and China remains our #1 trading partner. What happened, of course, later on, I guess we've had trade evolved across the globe. And then the TPP, which was in the P4 TPP, there was some angst and people marching up and down the streets in parts of New Zealand against, I guess, the issues around ISDS and the fear that we had big corporations controlling trade. And that was kind of running counter to what most New Zealanders understood as a fair chance and fair trade. David Parker, I have to give him credit with Jacinda, went to Vietnam, of course, and TPP was in a somewhat of a turmoil at that point. The US was in and out and all around the place. And I think New Zealand, with the aid of Canada and others, of course, added in comprehensive and progressive TPP. And that agreement, has been very, very good for all of us. And at the time, I think, there were some questions from the opposition, Todd, and they were fair questions around the agreement. But overall, we brought, as I say, it was a super majority to support that agreement. As we've moved forward with the EU, the UK, and now, of course, more recently with India, in the meantime, we signed RCEP. We did an upgrade of the China FTA. All of those things have been generally supported across the House. There's always been a bit of politicking, and I guess Winston has been part of that with both the China FTA and now with the India Free Trade Agreement. It does send confused signals out around the world. And it is really important that we establish what are the principles of our trade policy. I was asked over the last couple of weeks about trade for all. Trade for all was something that David Parker brought in as an acknowledgement of the social license required to continue to push ahead with trade agreements. It was an obligation and around the process to consult with and bring in the interest of small medium enterprises, women, Māori, other parts of our economy who had felt alienated from trade agreements and from the benefits of trade, and that we laid that out through both the UK FTA, through the EU FTA, and I know there was some discussion at a political level around the value of trade for all. Some sectors thinking that it was unnecessary, some woke objectives around international climate obligations. Maybe we didn't need to consider small, medium enterprises, the interests of women and Indigenous. We stand by that, and I know that for the most part, the government does as well. Inclusion of those commitments in the India FTA is acknowledgement of that, and I want to acknowledge negotiators and Todd for that. So generally speaking, we do have a bipartisan approach to trade, but we do have, under the MMP environment, of course, we have minor parties coming in from the side with different perspectives. That is something for us to, I guess, both acknowledge and work on harder. We certainly had to with our coalition parties, the Green Party in particular, who's always a bit wary of trade. And I guess that the coalition government at the moment with Winston's opinion just exposes the reality that we can't take trade agreements and the social license for them for granted. We need to remain committed to all sectors across our society to ensure that they understand the values of the agreement and the rules around trade and the, I guess, the structures that the WTO has provided for the world. So look, that's all I'll say. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for the chance to answer some questions. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. And I actually have a question for you both, given that you have waded into politicking, if you will, or the coalition. You both had experience being in opposition while the government is negotiating a free trade agreement, and perhaps there were things that you might have done differently. So I'd love your comments, if you could, and perhaps we'll go to you first, Minister. Maybe there's not, which will also be great.
No. Well, Look, a couple of things. The first is we need to trace the negotiators. So the people that advise the Labor government are the same ones that advise me. They are often the same negotiators. Now, the take you may take as a government, the direction you want to go, and some of the mandate and so on you give them could be different, but these are the same people. So I think that New Zealanders can trust in that system, that actually we have some of the most experienced and best negotiators in the world, and that's evidenced by almost every trade agreement we have is with the countries that are bigger than us, both geographically through population, but also the size of their economy. So we do very, very well there. I just from a point, and this is not at all political, but if you think about it, with the TPP agreement that went on to the CPTPP, there was not a lot of difference between the two, with the exception that, I mean, apart from the name change and the US had pulled out, Labor went in and had recognised that ICS was a challenge and was able to get side letters with some of the countries, not all of them. So the CPTPP does still have that in it for us, investor-state dispute settlement, albeit not as wide as it was. But I think there was a recognition there that actually, whilst the protection itself had probably been important for New Zealand, it was not well understood, and there was a better way to do it so we could continue to build confidence in trade and support that. Labor at the time with the CPTPP and government needed national support to get that deal over the line, because one of their coalition partners had not supported, just as we are relying, or New Zealand exporters are relying upon Labor support to get the India trade deal. So none of these things are all that unusual. They happen, they've happened before. And I think it comes to the general recognition that if you're in government and the larger parties have to look at the overall good for the country as opposed to the politics of it. Politics will often happen. Some of the position that of parties during election year around the TPP was because it was election year, but I think in the end, the country won out as we were able to find a way through. Is there anything we'd do differently? The only thing would be find ways so between trade spokespeople and trade ministers on both sides of the House, Damien and I, David Parker previously, maybe Tim Grosson was there before, knowing the systems of the people, it's easier to understand and reach agreement. Probably one of the things I've tried to do this term, and I think Damien probably did it as well, but would want to do more of, is making officials and me as minister available, but to the public, more the committee in Parliament as we go through, to give briefings, both in public to talk about things and also maybe a bit behind closed door. And the only reason I say behind closed door is because there will be things that we might want to share that we wouldn't in public, because it could weaken your position in a negotiation. I would love to know what those we negotiate want from us and what they're thinking, and those sorts of things makes our job easier. But actually, we can do much more in public. We can be very open. There are a few things that we do that we wouldn't want to talk about or share with people, other than having to keep some of it very close so we can get the best deal for New Zealand. So how do we demystify trade from what it was, probably through the TPP, where it was ongoing and very complex with many countries? Few New Zealanders knew enough about it, so they became concerned, to one, when I had signed it, I went around the country, did 50 public meetings, and that concern started to dissipate as we were open and we talked much, much more. And so that's something we probably, from a bipartisan point of view, could talk a bit about in our next Parliament, how we ensure the Select Committee can be a bit open and be a bit more involved. And it's not how do we bring people with us, but how we get them to the point where they understand that ministers and negotiators are only overseas to get the best deal they can for New Zealanders. When I go overseas, I'm sure Damien was the same, I don't go to fix the problems of the world. I go to sort out a better deal for New Zealand. If we can fix a few of those world problems along the way, well, that's to our betterment.
Mm. And Damien, is there anything that you'd comment there with regards to the experience, or how you might make decisions on what you'd comment on publicly during the process, and which outcomes you'd ultimately support?
Look, I mean, Todd makes a very good point that we have the same high-quality negotiators. They've worked their way through successive governments, and with some people rolling in and out, they're all very, very good. But politics does change, I guess, the approach to some of these agreements, and provide opportunities in some cases, whether it's the change in the US president, or whether it's the change in the prime minister of our respective countries. It just does alter I guess, the pitch. And in some ways it makes it harder, and in some ways it opens up doors. And I think the reason we have an EU trade agreement is not because of the opportunities that we offer commercial interests in the EU. It was an ambition from the EU to get in place a very high quality agreement that did focus on the shared values. And I guess that's where, there might be some differences. And Todd refers to, the first objective is to get the best opportunities for New Zealand exporters. And I guess the trade for all policy, if you're talking with a wider group in society, they will have different ambitions for both trade and global, I guess, progress. And so the one, that is the topical one, of course, is around emissions and around Paris and our commitment to it. There's been an ongoing commitment from both National and Labour, of course, but different views around some of the other parties. Ensuring that we do keep on track, and that if we're to just park that to one side and we say we're getting the short-term interest of New Zealand exporters first and foremost, and the global issues around emissions reduction will park to one side. I think if we start doing that, we will slip back in terms of our international reputation. So always incorporating the values of our country and the aspirations that we have for the wider globe, I think is part of our trade agreements. It has been of all of them. And I know that, as I say, India has incorporated many of those value judgments, those value objectives around Māori, around small, medium enterprises and others. And that's the way it should be. So I don't think we should forget about those objectives. If we're to do anything, I think it is making sure that we do keep in a confidential way the key opposition party of the day involved. I think that would be smart. I don't think we did that probably as well as we could have with the UK or the EU trade agreement. I mean, in the end, of course, National came in and supported that, which is great. Again, if we'd had a little more knowledge on the India FTA, maybe we could have come in and behind that more quickly.
Can I just jump on that? And you're right. It comes to how we build trust, and politics is never going to go away because our system is an adversarial one, right? And I can remember when we went to opposition, when the CPTPP was being formed and had been very deeply involved in that in the early days and got it pretty close, and the officials were sent off with direction to get it there. It wasn't landed, but almost could have been all but putting that aside, my approach was very adversarial as the former minister that had been deeply involved, and then the opposition spokesperson when we were in the House. And that's the job in Parliament. But actually putting that aside, once you get over yourself a little bit, that agreement is in the best interests of New Zealand. It always has been. It has changed, to a degree. Mainly, a lot of the opposition to it in New Zealand was actually about America being involved, as opposed to what was in the text and so on. Right. So that's an important thing. Damien and I have found ways over the last 3 years to be able to work well together. I took a position the moment I got the job. If we're going to say we're bipartisan, it should be more than just when we're voting, and trying to extend out, the things we've done. Because trade agreements, whether it's been negotiation or conclusion or entry into force, well, then the benefits go across parliaments and they go across parties. And so I've always tried to reach out and where possible, allow Damien to be involved and speak at the various meetings and so on, or the celebrations, because actually I think the New Zealand business community likes to see that. It gives them confidence. And the recent WTO ministerial meeting in Cancun, he and I jumped on a plane and flew 47 hours point to point through the Middle East to get there, but made the case internally in the government that the opposition's spokesperson for trade should come to the ministerial meeting with me, because actually in the end of WTO it will endure, and it is in the best interest of New Zealand for us to build an understanding. So, whether that's possible in the future, but we should make every effort to try to do that sort of thing, not from the point of view of politics, from the point of view it gives confidence to our exporters that actually trade policy is enduring, and smaller parties are allowed to have their views. They will always have those, but ultimately it's the two main parties that have to be as close as they can, albeit we'll have different ways to achieve things, than each other. And so, we should keep building on that.
I couldn't agree more. I think the New Zealand community would probably love to even have it be more visible, because it is something that I don't think people necessarily do appreciate. But I think the world business community welcomes seeing that much longer term approach to the issues that are around stability as it pertains to trade. And Damien, you mentioned Paris, which is an interesting one because, of some of the major challenges New Zealand faces over the coming decades, like responding to climate change or providing for our aging population or lifting our economic productivity, there seems to be general agreement across the political spectrum that we need to take action, but less clear on what the action should be. And there's a strong case that effective solutions to these challenges require consistent policy settings over decades, which in effect means some level of durable cross-partisan agreement, the kind that we've been speaking of through this webinar so far. But do you think that we should be aiming for more cross-party agreement on certain long-term issues? And if so, and this is a question for both of you, which issues and what lessons do you think can be drawn from New Zealand's approach to trade policy?
Yes, there should be. Both Todd and I have been around for a wee while, and that both helps and hinders some of our views. I can remember a superannuation accord that was actually put to one side by a national government in the past. No, I'm not referring to one at the moment. We have had attempts, and through the decades, I guess, to do this, and it is hard to hold the line in a political environment that, as Todd said, is adversarial, and that's healthy for the most part. We've had agreement on general infrastructure, direction of travel. We have had it in Paris, but again, we're seeing some of the minor parties looking to divert away from that. It is essential that our relevance in the world depends upon our consistency in messaging to the world, and we're too small, and will become irrelevant if we start sending confused messages on some of those big issues. We can lead the world in terms of some of the values and aspirations. We've done so in the past with the UN, nuclear free. And these are things that parties have bought into and generally accept as having been good for our nation. Into the future, the more that we can do, the better. We can't afford to waste resources, energy. We have too few people. We have too little money. And so let's focus on the areas where we agree on more. And I think there's potential for that. But we have to be realistic about, as I say, the healthy democracy we have.
Yeah. Well, it's very boring. I'd almost agree with all of that or most of it. But the point here is that we don't have to agree on everything. Within the political parties, we don't agree with everything. The debate that we have when it's respectful is healthy. It actually, if you have a strong opposition pushing you hard, you get better outcomes. You think of better policies. You work harder. And if you don't have a fantastic, hardworking government like ours, then you end up being a lazy opposition. And I say that jokingly, right? But the point of this is actually there are many areas where you get close to consensus. I think in as far as agriculture is concerned and climate change, there are differences between the two major parties and some of the others, but they're not as significant as they were in the past. Farmers must meet an obligation. How we decide upon that obligation, how we do it, we may differ, but ultimately they're moving in that direction now. Some would like to see much more of that, and some would like to see much less, but we are committing, the debate as to whether we have to do it or not is over. Customers and consumers have choices overseas. How we do it in the cost of New Zealand, how we get there is what we've been going through. And there has been support from different parties, including Labour, for some of these things. You think about the approach to infrastructure. We know we need it. We know that foreign direct investment is important. It can help grow things more quickly in New Zealand, deliver the infrastructure we need more quickly than we could do alone. Actually, there is not a huge difference of view on this between the two major parties, although some of the things that, and the way to do it would differ. So I think the answer is there are areas where we are close to reaching agreement, but we never should on everything, nor will we be able to. If you take some of the things that in trade agreement, I have always had a view that trade agreement should be about trade. But actually, for our exporters and for customers and consumers and other governments, they have a view that other things should be in there. And so I've always accepted that. In fact, the view I had about them just being about trade, getting tariff rates down and giving certainty and lowering non-tariff barriers and getting goods and services over the border more easily is more than a decade ago. And in the time I've had an opposition, you see how things evolve. And so you keep pace with that. And in some of our agreements, they are stronger than others, which has more to do with the partner we're negotiating with than necessarily what we think in New Zealand. So, and as far as Damien saying there are things that are important and, we can show leadership on them, I agree completely. And I think we have across successive governments on the world stage on behalf of New Zealand. But when it comes to trade and trade agreements, we can't lose sight of what a trade agreement does. It is a give advantage to New Zealand exporters in a market overseas because they have preference before others do. They can grow market share, or it levels the playing field so they can compete fairly, and I know that they will do well. We can't do that at the expense of the environment or climate change and other things, because consumers have choices and they will as easily choose someone else as they will New Zealand, even if our products and services are the best in the world.
Thank you. We have come up on the time where we have some questions. We have a number of questions in the Q&A. If you're okay if we proceed to those, and I'll start you with an easy one from Stephen Jacoby. You may know him. His reputation may precede him, but Stephen's question is: it is sometimes said that trade agreements are not primarily about trade, but about making the world safe for multinational enterprises. How do our two panelists representing different streams of political thought react to that?
No, I don't think it's about multinationals, although, of course, where they employ people in New Zealand and so on, that is important. What they do is create certainty for any business in New Zealand that wants to export. And my approach has always been thinking about the smaller business, not the very, very large one. We have to get rules right so Fonterra can sell the high-quality dairy product that the world wants and is willing to pay a lot for. They are a very large company. They're able to do a lot of the things themselves. Our job is to get the access for them and make sure that Canada with the CPTPP make sure that Canada is honouring their obligation to them. But I always thought about the smaller company, the smaller producer. If we can get them into markets, how can they easily navigate the processes? How can we level the playing field, get tariff rates down, give them the certainty they need, so that the risk to go into a market overseas and invest your time and capital, that risk diminishes and is manageable and quantifiable. So I don't think the trade agreements that New Zealand does about the big multinationals of the world, albeit we have some pretty big companies in New Zealand that do really well for us and produce a huge amount of jobs. When 1 in 4 jobs in New Zealand comes from exports, it tells you how significant it is, but it's more broader than that, the indirect jobs and so on. And so, it's about doing the sorts of things first. When it comes to multilateral agreements, the WTO and so on, look, it's the idea that everybody benefits. But Damien would be the same as me. And when I've been to these meetings, and I've had the good fortune, the privilege of being a co-chair and negotiator in the last 2 WTO ministerial meetings, and just recently one of the vice chairs, and vice chair at the OECD, as well as looking at what they need to achieve in an organisation. I spent a lot of time about reform of agricultural subsidy that harms New Zealand farmers, but actually makes it more difficult for those in less developed countries to grow food and survive and do well for themselves. So we have an obligation more broadly to fix the rules in that respect, albeit the focus is making sure New Zealand companies do well.
Can I just comment on that? I think there was a perception it was for big corporate multinationals. That diminished somewhat, but I think it's actually been ramped up again by the Trump administration and by the interventions that they have imposed upon other countries. The perception is that it's for some of their own big multinationals. Now, I'm not making a judgment on that, other than many small businesses in small countries have been trampled on in the way. And I think that for New Zealand, it must be more than just we don't have that many big multinationals. Many of our companies are small and medium enterprises, trying to get into that space. So I think, for some time, our trade policy has been about, small, medium enterprises without stating it. That's why I'll come back to my point of a trade for all, which is actually a proactive promotion and social license exercise to ensure that the mandate for trade remains, and because people understand that it's not just for the big multinationals.
Right. Yeah, I was really, I welcome certainly those thoughts after my experience with ABAC around women's SMEs and Indigenous communities. Question around Latin America. So you've both referenced a CPTPP, and Damien, you joined the recent ministerial and parliamentary mission to Latin America. Do you see a realistic time frame for deeper trade ties with the region, and which sectors should New Zealand be prioritising first?
I do, but I don't know whether trade deals outside of the CPTPP are likely to happen quickly, although they're worth putting effort into. There are a couple of countries there I think we can prioritise. We've been talking. I've done a couple of visits. Our Minister Peters did with a big delegation. So there's interest in New Zealand. So we should think about how we do that. But the reason I think we're going to see trade grow both trade in goods and services and tourism and education and people-to-people contact and links. As last year, the government made a change to visa policy that means for Chinese nationals who transit New Zealand on their way to South America, they no longer need a visa. They get off the plane, back on the plane and carry on. And as a result of that, we're starting to see Chinese airlines use Auckland as their base to go to South American cities. The easiest way to get from Southeast Asia to South America is via Auckland, and that policy has brought them here. When I was just up at the APEC meeting in China a few weeks ago, I visited a couple of other centres and met with an airline who are likely, by the end of this year or next year, announce direct flights to Lima and Peru via Auckland. So we're going to have better air connectivity to South American cities than we have ever had before. And the planes will be full of people who will get visas and stop in New Zealand, or they'll come down and they'll make friends and they'll do business. So I think that will grow. If you go back to many, many years and you look at Africa, and I remember flying off to a trade meeting down in South Africa from Europe many years ago, and at night time, where you see roads that go country to country or rivers, there is lights all the way along it because that's business and industry and so on. And that merely is just the ability for people for transportation and so on. So with air links to South America, you will see an area of the world that is growing quickly and is confident, looking to the rest of the world. Mercosur is doing deals with people. You will see our trade grow, and as the trade grows, opportunities for trade deals with countries outside of those who are involved with the CPTPP will present themselves.
Can I just say, look, I think the Southern Link is a huge opportunity, and a single flight, has been the pathway to progress into many countries, and obviously the flights into China, a great example of that. South America, obviously a big competitor for us in many areas of primary industries and exports, and so there's a bit of a wariness there, but I think the opportunities are in services, not just in goods. Obviously, they produce a lot of food for themselves, but, a point of difference, different food products. But in the services area, I think there's massive opportunities there, and we just have to, I guess, pick the spots. We've had some unfortunate incidents around investment into some of the South American countries where, we've probably been a little bit cocky and a bit over ambitious. We've just got to ensure that when we do invest, when we do kind of go into those markets, then we take a realistic approach and show respect. They're very capable. They're ramping up their ability. Brazil's got carbon zero beef going to the international marketplace. So, they're ahead of us in some of these areas, and we've just got to show respect for that, but still open opportunities for many of the innovative exporters that we have.
Kia ora. Question from Fiona. What policy settings do we need to put in place or levers to use to build on the agreement with Singapore, which featured backup capacity and supply chain resilience, important areas of focus as we grapple with climate change and geopolitical shocks?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of, we've got the supply chain ones. You've seen the agreement that went up to sign just after I got back from India. Damien came up for the signing in India as we had MPs from a number of parties come along. Again, the idea that we should make it bipartisan and share this because it is significant, that India trade deal for all of New Zealand and all New Zealanders. Dare showed up to Singapore to sign the agreement on supply of essential goods or essential supplies. And in that, it's a world's first. We guarantee, Singapore guarantees to supply New Zealand with fuel and chemicals and medicines. In return, we will supply them with food. It's a commercial decision, but neither government will put restrictions in place. So there is growing interest in this, as I've just been overseas a few times from other countries. They see it as new, it's novel, no one else has done it before. With what's happening in Iran and the Middle East, it drives home to people that supply chain and resilience is about getting supplies. For New Zealand, if fuel doesn't come to if fertilizer doesn't come down to New Zealand for any reason, we don't get to put other goods, including logs and timber, on those ships to go back. And so it has quite an effect upon us. So the answer is, I think in the coming years, you will see either in trade agreements or on the side or side letters or similar to the agreement with Singapore, us looking to do these sorts of deals with other countries to give certainty to New Zealand exporters both import and export in the future, that when there are shocks, geopolitical or others around the world, the supplies that we need and things we produce will be guaranteed to be able to move across borders. It merely means that Singapore and New Zealand will not put in place at a government level restrictions on the supply of those things. And that's a very big positive for New Zealand exporters at the moment.
Can I just say, look, I acknowledge the formal signing of an agreement, which actually was negotiated through COVID with Singapore, a like-minded country, on the basis of sharing. And I've had a view, and some may have heard me say it, that trade is as much about sharing as it is selling. And this is a classic example of that, where we share values, we understand that we should share resources when necessary, and make sure there are no interventions when it comes to the movement at critical times. And so I agree with Todd that this will become part of, I guess, international trade, as full FTAs can't be negotiated, but there's agreements where parts of our economy can operate. The interdependency that we have on one another in many, many areas, and I guess US and China, a classic example. They can't walk away from one another because they are interdependent on one another. That applies to smaller countries as well. So we should continue to do that where necessary and where we have an opportunity.
Thank you. And on from there, switching gears from Singapore through to India, Sarah has asked, Kia ora, could you please speak about the recent India FTA and the positive experiences and the complications of cross-party agreement in the trade policy space?
Well, excuse me. Look, I think it's a great positive for New Zealand. 1.4 billion people. The world is knocking on the door. They're doing trade deals, and what we've been able to achieve, and what in the end is a short period of time compared to many other countries, is going to be significant for New Zealand in the decades and generations to come. It will end up being as important to us as the China agreement is, but it won't be in place of China or the US or the European Union. It's an addition. It's another. It's an extra, right? And ultimately, we didn't get everything that we might have wanted, or we didn't get anywhere near as much dairy as we wanted, although we did get some very high value things, some things that will be important to us both now and in the future, but nobody else in the world has either, although we've got a commitment from India. If they give dairy to someone else, then they will talk to us. We have the opportunity to raise it and we get to negotiate. Think of it this way, just to finally on that bit, right? If we didn't sell any dairy to China last year, it is still our number one trading partner. So the growth across services and other areas of the primary sector and manufacturing and so on is going to be quite significant. I think that if there is a lesson to be learned here, it is that it's what New Zealand companies do, right? Why do our companies that are smaller than others do so well in markets overseas? It comes down to what it is to be a New Zealander, to be Kiwi. They get on the plane, they go and meet people, they don't go with big pretenses, and they get on and they form relationships and they do deals with each other commercially, and those deals stand the test of time. They don't go and try and do a deal and move to someone else and not honour their commitments. So I took the same approach with negotiators with India. We formed friendships and mutual respect, and were able to get to a point which I think the business committee saw when Minister Goyal, their trade minister, came here and we were up there for the launch, that actually the relationship was growing. Damien knows him very well. Damien met with him at the signing, and and they're friendly and chatted. We had a lunch, all of us together, on an event and so on. So actually, we just have to do what the business community does: get on well, get up to India, get to other nations, and do deals through mutual respect, and actually show what we bring to the table. Because I know that there are others in New Zealand and in Parliament that are not sure about this deal. They are 1.4 billion people. We are 5 million. I can't think of a single problem that India has that a country of 5 million people could fix. Realistically, honestly, we are small by comparison, but it's a high quality deal. It's one of the best they've done. It has rules in it that nobody else has negotiated. We are the only country in the world so far that manages our own quotas for the honey and the kiwi fruit and apples we send in there. Everyone else, the UK, India manages it. We have built trust and friendship with them, and we now need to get it through Parliament, be respectful, and then get on and make the most of it, because it will be worth jobs and exports to New Zealand, and it will allow us, in a difficult world where we're not sure what's happening with America, as Europe looks at what they do, as other parts of the world put in protection, it's another part of the AND strategy that gives certainty to New Zealand exporters.
Can I just say, look, any agreement with India has huge potential, and it was important that we ensured that the agreement was a positive one. We'd heard accusations from Winston, Coalition Party, that this wasn't something that he thought was good for us. So when we did get the text, and Todd shared that confidentiality, in confidentiality, we understand, and I certainly do, around the finer points of negotiation and the fact that not all these details should have been out in the public until they were finalised. We went through that. We did double check on some of the issues and some of the claims, and on balance, it does offer and open up opportunities for a large number of exporters. There is the question around the investment. It is one that is unusual. That is that over time, I guess the risk builds around that we have not met their expectations. And so we needed to point that out, and I had discussions with some of the industry sectors, pointing out to them that, in negotiating the easier access, there is a risk that if we don't perform in terms of promotion of that trade, or promotion of that investment, that they may at some point in the future pull the rug out from under us. I think that if we've built up enough valuable partnerships between our two countries, that won't happen. But nonetheless, in the detail of the trade agreement, it remains a potential risk for us into the future.
Thank you. And I think that I'll give you the question and tell you what I've heard on this next one. But there was a question that followed up, which was to say, what strategies have proven most effective in managing public skepticism about trade agreements, and how can governments communicate economic benefits without deepening political polarization? What I've heard you say around the Indian FTA is really about walking the talk. Really essentially simply jumping in and getting it done, because that's a fairly swift answer to raising skepticism. But how do you feel about that one, Minister?
Well, look, I think the answer is be open to talk about it as much as you can. I remember during the EU negotiation, as we were, because I was a minister, we got commitment from the EU to do it. It was launched under Labour and concluded, and then we put it into place through ratification. And the reason they weren't able to launch is France kept having elections, and an election in France gets in the way of good old-fashioned trade negotiation with an agricultural producer like New Zealand. But I remember saying at the time, as we were looking at this, every time the EU has a negotiation with somebody, they publish some information about that meeting, and why can't we? And at the time, it was, well, you can never do that. It's really difficult and so on. And I joked with the officials and said, we're New Zealand. They know it's all about butter. Of course, our trade deals are much more than that now. And so we just got to find the things we can put out there. What I learned with the TPP, so I didn't negotiate the deal, Tim Grosser did, but I got to sign it. And you remember the marching and the process and so on. And I remember saying that we're going to go out and I'm going to do public meetings, and we'll do 50 of them. I'll keep turning up and talking and explaining until nobody wants to come to the meetings anymore. And we largely got to that point. And it was explaining and going through it and the reasons why, and dispelling myths and concerns. And Kiwis are right to want to know. And ultimately, I remember meeting a lady in my electorate who came to me after the signing, and she said, could I ask you a question? She said, I'm a bit worried about this deal and what it will mean in America and so on. And I asked her what she did. And she and her husband had just had a child. She was taking a little bit of time out of work. Her husband worked in a company that exported around the world and to the US. And I realized that we'd got it wrong, that her livelihood and her family's livelihood was reliant upon a job, that it was directly involved in exports, but she was wondering if this was a good thing. And it wasn't her fault, it was ours. So we just need to be open and talk about these things a lot more. So that's the way that we bring the public with us, respecting the right for some members of the public to not like trade. They're allowed to do that, but we have to make the case and bring people with us. And actually the trade missions we've been doing and the signings and the other things and so on are talking very openly about the reasons why and explaining what it means and so on, I think helps to give comfort to New Zealanders who innately know that actually a very large part of our economy and the jobs comes from what we produce and the exports, and actually we cannot consume all of the goods and services we produce. We must be exporting, and we need these trade deals to keep the economy strong.
Can I just say, of course, it's essential that the wider public understand the value of trade. And as I say, I'll go back to my Trade for All kind of strategy, which was about that education process. We see in the US, if you don't explain to people, if you just simply gouge out their jobs, their opportunities, and you replace them with imports, then you lose that social license. We do have some risks ahead of us. The price of butter, which is I guess the topical issue of us exporting so much dairy and yet having unaffordable food or claims of unaffordable butter in particular on our supermarket shelves. These are issues that we do have to work through. Otherwise, they will come to a head in a it might be a cheap political opportunistic way. We can't afford to have that happen. And when we do have issues like food security internally for a food exporting country, we've got to work through that. There are no magical solutions, but that's one area in particular that I think is important for us as we move forward.
Look, we are all but at the end of our time today. Before I conclude our session with a couple of closing comments, I'll go first. Damien, do you have any final words? And I'll give a final word to the Minister.
Look, just thank you for the opportunity to do this and these seminars and many more others around trade, the value of it, the importance of it, and being able to answer the hard questions to people. I'm confronted by people on the street who, say, this trade stuff is no good for us at all. They're holding a cell phone, they've got a watch on and they're, driving a car that's been imported. People don't kind of connect the dots always. So we have to explain they have busy lives. They've got pressure on them. Trade doesn't feature on their day-to-day lives. We've just got to use opportunities like this. So thank you very much for that. Kia ora.
Minister.
Well, look, I think it's a very helpful conversation, and the questions have helped a lot as well, because it reminds us of the things that we need to do. New Zealand's very good at negotiating trade deals. New Zealand is good at exporting around the world. We have this international reputation of being honest brokers, of not just promoting ourselves, of trying to get a system that works for everybody. I think it's why, as a small country, we're invited to be involved in so many things that we might not be otherwise. In a couple of weeks' time, the FIT Partnership, Future Investment and Trade Partnership, which is 16 small to medium-sized economies have come together to look for ways to reach agreement, not trade agreements to reduce costs and barriers and allow trade to be easier amongst ourselves. We're hosting that in New Zealand. We were one of 3 other countries that came up with the idea and promoted it, and look, now there's 16. And so it's important that we're reminded, as good as we are doing things overseas, we have to keep talking about and demonstrating to New Zealanders the benefits for them. And the reason I've got to do that, it reminds you that when you go off to negotiate, you do a trade mission, it is about the benefits for New Zealanders. And I'm yet to meet a trade minister from New Zealand or an official from New Zealand or negotiator that doesn't go overseas to get the best deal we can for Kiwis, because it creates jobs and incomes, and it means we don't have to eat everything that we produce.
Thank you very much. We are, I couldn't agree more, and we are at our time for today. So just very briefly, if I could summarize, what strikes me most about this conversation is that New Zealand's bipartisan trade policy isn't really a story of political goodwill so much as it is a story about a shared reality. So when your country's prosperity depends on access to markets that you don't control, as we don't, and the cost of inconsistency becomes impossible to ignore, that structural clarity has done more to hold trade policy together across governments than any deliberate act of cooperation. And what Minister McClay and Damien have illustrated today is that bipartisanship in practice isn't about agreement on everything. It's about knowing which debates to have, which ones to have publicly, which ones to keep inside the room. And that discipline, in my humble opinion, is harder than it looks, and arguably more important now than it has ever been, as the international trading environment becomes less predictable and the rules-based system comes under real strain. So the question that our conversation leaves me with today is whether we can replicate the discipline that we've seen across our trade policy in other areas where New Zealand equally cannot afford that short-termism. So climate, productivity, the ageing population, the structural pressures are really just as real there, and the political conditions for the same kind of durability are so far a little less settled. But trade policy bipartisanship took decades to embed. The work of identifying where else it's possible and being honest about where it isn't feels like the task ahead. I think you've both articulated it beautifully. Really, really appreciated your participation today. Nō reira, ngā mihi nui kia kōrua, Minister Damien, and thank you all for joining us today.